There's a generation that doesn't announce its struggles, doesn't flood timelines with self-help quotes, doesn't chase likes, applause, or digital validation, but quietly, steadily, relentlessly. They built the backbone of the modern world. They're called Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980, Gen X grew up in a cultural in-between. They weren't raised in the polished optimism of the post-war boom, and they weren't shaped by the hyper-connected digital childhood that came later. They grew up during economic instability, rising divorce rates, corporate layoffs, Cold War anxiety, MTV culture, and empty houses after school. They were the original latchkey kids. No constant supervision, no smartphones, no participation trophies. If something broke, they fixed it. If something hurt, they handled it. If something failed, they adjusted. They learned independence early, a distinct, not as a lifestyle choice, but as a survival skill. And psychologically, that changes a person. It builds resilience, but it also builds guardedness. It creates adaptability, but it can also create emotional distance. Generation X became masters of self-reliance, skeptical of authority, unimpressed by hype, comfortable in silence. They don't need the spotlight, because they were never raised in it. Today, we're breaking down the psychology behind this overlooked generation. Why they trust actions more than words. Why they avoid drama and digital noise. Why they prepare for worst-case scenarios. And why, in a world addicted to attention, Gen X might be the most mentally steady generation alive. This isn't nostalgia. This is behavioral science. And once you understand it, you'll see Generation X differently. Generation X is often called the latchkey generation, and that label isn't symbolic, it's literal. Millions of Gen X kids walked home from school, unlocked the front door, and stepped into an empty house. No parent waiting in the kitchen, no after-school texts checking in, no GPS tracking, no digital safety net. Just silence. Both parents were often working. Divorce rates were climbing. Economic pressure was real. Supervision was lighter. Expectations were heavier, so they adapted. From a psychological standpoint, this kind of childhood accelerates autonomy. When children repeatedly face small problems alone, burnt dinners, missed buses, sibling conflicts, boredom that stretches for hours, they develop internal coping systems. They become self-reliant. They learn emotional containment. They sharpen situational awareness. They build internal problem-solving skills. They don't panic first, they assess first. But here's the part no one talks about. Independence born from necessity carries a hidden cost. Attachment theory tells us that when emotional support feels inconsistent, children often shift into self-sufficiency mode. They minimize needs. They quiet emotions. They stop expecting rescue. Not because they're naturally detached, because depending on someone didn't always feel reliable. So they became their own backup plan. That's why many Gen X adults rarely ask for help. They don't overshare. They don't dramatize. They don't expect someone else to fix things. They figured it out alone. Homework, heartbreak, hard decisions. And decades later, they still default to the same pattern. Handle it. Solve it. Move on. That's the psychological fingerprint of the latchkey era. Strength forged in solitude. Gen X grew up before the internet reshaped attention. No social media feeds, no influencers selling lifestyles, no endless comparison loops running 24/7. Their culture wasn't personalized by an algorithm, it was discovered. They were shaped by late-night MTV, independent films, grunge music, garage bands, comic book shops, and underground movements that felt raw and unscripted. If you wanted connection, you found it in real places. If you wanted identity, you explored it offline. And most importantly, they experienced boredom. Real boredom. Long summer days, quiet afternoons, nothing to scroll, nothing to refresh. Psychologically, boredom is powerful. Research shows it strengthens creativity, reflection, and independent thinking. It forces the brain to generate stimulation instead of consuming it. Gen X learned to sit with discomfort, to entertain themselves, to build imagination from scratch, to focus deeply without constant interruption. Their nervous systems weren't flooded with dopamine hits every few seconds. So as adults, many of them prefer privacy. They don't overshare. They don't crave constant feedback. And they often feel drained by modern digital noise. They grew up in silence. And because of that, they don't fear it. Generation X came of age during disruption. They watched corporate layoffs sweep through neighborhoods. They lived through economic recessions that shook household stability. They saw political scandals dominate headlines. They witnessed entire industries rise fast and collapse even faster. They were told a simple formula: work hard, stay loyal, you'll be rewarded. Then they watched their parents give decades to companies, only to be downsized without warning. That kind of experience leaves a psychological mark. It creates pragmatic skepticism, not loud rebellion, not conspiracy thinking, just quiet, watchful realism. Gen X doesn't automatically trust corporations. They question government promises. They don't assume the media tells the full story. And they rarely idolize authority. Because they learned early, systems protect themselves first. So they adapted. They keep backup plans. They build transferable skills. They save quietly. They prepare for worst-case scenarios. They value competence over titles, stability over hype, substance over branding. They're not cynical for drama. They're cautious by experience. They don't believe in fairy tales. They believe in contingency plans, because they've seen what happens when you don't have one. Here's something people rarely say out loud. Generation X wasn't raised in the age of emotional affirmation. There were no conversations about processing feelings, no language for holding space, no viral posts about mental health awareness. Instead, the messaging was simple: walk it off. Stop crying. Be tough. So, emotional suppression became normal. Not cruel, just cultural. From a psychological perspective, this builds emotional containment, and containment can create resilience. It trains you to regulate under pressure, to stay steady in chaos, to function when things fall apart. But there's a second edge to that sword. When emotions are consistently managed internally, vulnerability can start to feel unsafe or unnecessary or uncomfortable. That's why many Gen X adults handle stress silently. They don't dramatize hardship. They downplay their struggles. They avoid public emotional displays. They pride themselves on being low maintenance. They are strong. But sometimes that strength feels isolating, because they weren't taught to express pain outwardly. They were taught to absorb it, process it, and move forward without making noise. They don't broadcast emotions. They manage them internally, and often alone. Generation X is the bridge generation. They remember rotary phones hanging on kitchen walls, busy signals, handwritten letters that took days to arrive, paper maps spread across the hood of a car, life before Google answered every question in seconds. If you wanted information, you looked it up in an encyclopedia. If you wanted directions, you planned ahead. If you wanted to talk, you called, or you showed up. And then as adults, they adapted to the internet, email, smartphones, remote work, social media, streaming, cloud storage. They didn't grow up with technology. They learned it. Psychologically, that creates cognitive flexibility. Their brains developed in a slower, less fragmented environment. Attention spans were built before notifications existed. Deep focus was trained before multitasking became mandatory. So when the digital wave hit, they adjusted, without being fully shaped by it. They understand both worlds. They value face-to-face trust, real-world conversation, eye contact, long-form discussions that don't fit into a caption. But they can also navigate apps, platforms, and digital systems with competence. The difference? They weren't born into algorithms that constantly predict, influence, and manipulate behavior. So they're often less emotionally reactive to online noise, less dependent on constant updates, less attached to digital identity. They use technology as a tool, not as a mirror, not as validation, not as a substitute for real life. They adapted to the digital world, but they were built in the analog one. And that balance might be one of their greatest psychological advantages. Culturally, Generation X often feels invisible. Baby boomers dominated politics and corporate leadership. Millennials reshaped media narratives and workplace culture. Gen Z now drives digital trends and online conversations. And Gen X, they've been quietly working in the background. Psychologists sometimes describe this pattern as the middle child dynamic. In family systems theory, middle children often grow up between louder, more demanding siblings. As a result, they learn to adapt, to negotiate, to stay independent, to avoid unnecessary drama. They don't fight for the spotlight, they build stability instead. Like middle children, Gen X developed self-sufficiency. They became problem solvers, peacemakers, realists. They learned how to operate without constant recognition. They don't demand attention. They don't center every conversation around themselves. They don't need public validation to measure their worth. But invisibility does not equal insignificance. They built companies that power today's economy. They raised families through rapid cultural change. They stabilized industries during technological disruption. They carried responsibility without announcing it. No viral declarations, no constant rebranding, no applause required, just consistent effort. And sometimes the most influential generation isn't the loudest one. It's the one that keeps everything running. Quietly. Generation X wasn't overprotected. They weren't constantly praised. They weren't monitored every second. They weren't shaped by algorithms predicting what they should think, buy, or believe. They were shaped by independence, by uncertainty, by empty houses after school, by economic shifts, by learning to adapt before they fully understood what adaptation meant. They didn't grow up curated. They grew up figuring it out. And maybe that's exactly why they're so steady now. They don't panic at every headline. They don't broadcast every emotion. They don't chase every trend. They don't measure their value in likes or visibility. They assess. They adjust. They keep moving. Silently. There's a groundedness to Generation X, a psychological center of gravity that doesn't swing wildly with cultural mood shifts, because they were built before the constant feedback loop, before public identity became a performance. They know how to be alone without feeling erased. They know how to struggle without announcing it. They know how to rebuild without demanding applause. They endure, they adapt, they survive. And in a world that often feels addicted to attention, outrage, and instant reaction, their restraint is power, their privacy is strength, their steadiness is rare. Generation X may not dominate the loudest conversations, but they built resilience in silence, and that might be their greatest psychological advantage of all.